All right, so this is mobility lawyer Paris Malakouti Fitzgerald. Thanks for joining, everybody. This is the sixth mobility space that I've done so far. Today, we're talking about American dual citizenship, benefits, drawbacks, and issues. We're going to do 50 mobility spaces this year. We have an aggressive schedule. We're going to do Monday and Thursday of each week. So everybody's welcome to join. We have a lot of interesting topics coming up here. So today we're talking about American dual citizenship, right? And generally dual citizenship is unique. It has unique issues. And I would say American dual citizenship has even more unique issues because America is the global hegemon. It's the most powerful country on earth. So I wanted to take this discussion, this space to talk about some of those issues, get people's perspectives, and of course, anybody is welcome to speak. Anybody wants to speak is welcome to do so at any time. Just send me a request, and we'll get into it. So I'm going to start off today by basically just listing off some of the items from a tweet that I made a few days ago about some of the peculiarities of American dual citizenship, and we can, unpack some of these. If we have time, we'll unpack all of them. But I think these are, as a practitioner, these are a lot of the things that people ask me about, a lot of things that are on people's minds, that are, clients basically that are looking for citizenship elsewhere if they're American, or sometimes if it's somebody that's naturalizing into U.S. citizenship. So, number one. So, what does it mean to be an American dual citizen? So, number one, it means having the immediate highest right of entry in two separate countries. Number two, it means having the immediate highest right of residency in two countries. Those are two different things, right? Entry and residency. Entry is the ability to come and go, right? To use the citizenship as a tourist visa, a glorified tourist visa, a super tourist visa, for example, if you're living outside the United States. And of course, highest right of residency means the ability to come here, set up shop, and stay indefinitely. So, number three, it means having a differing set of legal obligations, some extraterritorial. And in my opinion, that's the key issue, extraterritorial obligations when you're talking about multiple citizenship. So it means having a differing set of legal obligations, some extraterritorial to two different countries, one of which is the most powerful country on earth. Number four, it means being able to have two passports to travel on, two sets of visa-free access negotiated by two countries, and two foreign ministries to provide consular assistance if you're in a jam abroad. Number five, it means two sets of domestic legal ID and possibly two sets of birth certificates as well. And we spoke about that last aspect in our previous mobility space just here. Um, Number six, it means, unfortunately, being a tax resident in the United States, pretty much no matter where you live, what other citizenships you gain or lose. Number seven, it means having a higher level of protection from non-US defamation lawsuits, or at least their enforcement against you in the United States. This is something that's not really spoken about at all, actually. I barely hear this spoken about. Under US federal law, if you are subject to a foreign defamation lawsuit and there's a judgment against you, that judgment is unenforceable against you in the United States unless the standards for free speech law in that jurisdiction, which rendered the libel judgment against you, are at least as strong as the US First Amendment. This has not been spoken about that much. I think this is going to be more important in the coming years because of the rise of social media. Everybody's an influencer on some level nowadays, right? Nowadays, our persona, both personal and public, is online. What does that mean? That means basically broadcasting out to the world, to 190 plus countries. That potentially means, somebody trying to take a shot at you for a defamation lawsuit in 190 plus countries. That's one benefit of being a U.S. citizen. Number nine, um, it means having to enter the US as a US citizen with a US passport, right? So if you're a dual citizen, if you're a French American citizen, a Nicaraguan American citizen, a Maltese American citizen, you have to enter the United States using a US passport, and you're going to be treated only as a US citizen within the United States. Number nine, in other countries, meaning not the United States, it means being able to toggle between nationalities. And that's a concept that I think is really important for multiple citizenship. The idea, what I call identity toggling or nationality toggling. Number 10, in cyberspace, it means also being able to toggle between nationalities, whether openly or surreptitiously using a VPN or other tools. to benefit from crypto exchanges, investment products, gig websites, apps, electronic services that are sometimes restricted by law to people of a certain nationality, right? So if you're trying to access some sort of service or website or product that's restricted to a certain nationality, nationality toggling allows you to, right, use identity documents for that second or third nationality and possibly have access to whatever that product is, legally or illegally, right? It's sometimes that's not lawful, but it is a reality of being a multiple citizen. Number 11, and we're almost done here. There's 12, and then we'll start opening this up for discussion, and we'll start getting into some of these in more detail. Number 11, it means you have two bridging residencies. The bridging residency concept, okay, it means basically being able to have access to set up shop in a country, okay, while you're figuring out what your next step is, okay? So the example I bring is you're a citizen of the US and country B. You live in country C, so a country that's not either of your countries of citizenship. You have to leave country C in a hurry due to war, economic collapse, persecution, genocide, famine, or some other strife. You're not sure when you want to go to just yet, but to immediately get off the X out of the danger zone, you can use the US or your other country of citizenship as a bridging residency until you figure out where you want to go long term. It means basically just having a place to bug out to short term, right? It's a bridging residency. And obviously, being citizen of a country provides the highest, the best bridging residency because there's no further applications required, no waiting, no difficulty, right? If you have to leave in a hurry, you because of right of return, you're able to return to your country of citizenship or even go there for the first time, right? While you figure out what your next step is. And then finally, number 12, being an American dual citizen means having associations with two different countries in the eyes of others, whether positive or negative. And one of those associations is highly polarizing, right? American. Being American isn't that popular in some parts of the world or to some people. In fact, to some people in some parts of the world, it's downright unpopular, right? You have associations with multiple countries. Your exposure to the consequences or benefits of those two associations depends in large part on you, how open you are, how public you are with all of your nationalities, or if you exercise the concept of second citizenship privacy. So these are the just 12. I mean, this doesn't cover everything about being an American dual citizen. There's too much, of course, to cover, right? And I'm sure this is a burgeoning field. There's probably things that I have not even figured out yet or thought about. But these are 12 big aspects, in my view, and for my clients and for people that I speak to about American dual citizenship. Should we unpack each one of them one by one? What should we talk about? What are we most interested in getting into right away? Anybody want to chime in?
Well, I will say, if you are an American citizen, I mean, the biggest thing is if you're living abroad, the U.S. is the only country in the world, essentially, that taxes you wherever you live. And so it does not matter how many other citizenships you have, you are obligated to pay tax on your worldwide income no matter where you're living, no matter where that income is sourced. And that is something that a lot of at-home Americans don't realize. The U.S. is the only country that does that, and it's something to be aware of. Yeah, so I don't know if someone else is going to speak, but that's a pretty big thing to consider, is that no matter where you're living, the U.S. is going to follow you tax-wise. Now, that's not true in other countries. So if you get a citizenship in another country, let's say you get a dual citizenship in, I don't know, Argentina or something, and you're not living in Argentina, the Argentinian tax authorities are going to leave you alone. They're not going to follow you wherever you live. The U.S. is very unique. I will also say, too, an interesting thing is if you are a dual citizen and you were born in the United States, most countries in the world today, their passports will they will say where you were born. And so if you're thinking about getting another citizenship, as an American who was born in the United States, every other country in the world, when they see your second passport, assuming that second passport lists your place of birth in the United States, they're going to know that you're also an American, because the U.S. has right of the soil And basically, that means that if you're born on U.S. soil, you are by definition a U.S. citizen. So be aware that if you are thinking of opening a bank account or whatever else on your second passport, that if it says that you were born in the U.S., they're going to know that you're a U.S. citizen unless you can prove that you have a certificate of loss of nationality.
Great point, Jono. And actually, I was talking on mute after the first round of you speaking, so that's why we had the dead air. I didn't realize that I was speaking on mute. Yes, excellent points. You're absolutely right, Jono. And of course, you and John Richardson and Anthony Perrin and so many other people are at the forefront of talking about this issue and painstakingly bringing it to the attention of Americans, right? Because the vast majority of people have, vast majority of Americans have no idea about citizenship-based taxation. Huge issue, right? And we've already spoken, over and over again about the fact that if Americans are ever able to unyoke themselves from citizenship-based taxation, of course, that would be an enormous boon to the value of American citizenship, especially for Americans that live abroad. Jono, the way I think about that issue, just from a practical matter, right? Because I'm a mobility lawyer, right? The issues with worldwide reporting and, of course, tax liability for American citizens. It's a much bigger issue for people that are naturalizing into U.S. citizenship or even just applying for a green card, right? If you're an American citizen and you're here, right, and you're trying to come into American dual citizenship by adding the other citizenship, right? Then that factor of American citizenship-based taxation is not really that much of a factor for decision-making purposes, right? At least not in a negative aspect, right? It might be in a positive aspect, right? Some of my clients, I'd say most of my clients that are American outbound, they just want the plan B. They're curious. They don't know exactly where they want to go long term, but if they can get the citizenship without having to first be resident elsewhere, so typically we're talking about by descent or investment, they want to do it. Now, some clients and some percentage of those clients are, I think the term is renunciation-curious, right? So they don't have any plans to renounce American citizenship, but they're aware, they're at least cognizant that it might be something they consider seriously in the future, and they don't want to be left stateless or try to renounce U.S. citizenship into statelessness if it's that case. So they basically, their understanding is they're going to get a second citizenship so that they can have the plan B and then possibly renounce U.S. citizenship in the future. So, yeah. So from a practical standpoint, right, meaning for actionable information, that's a big issue for if you're choosing to immigrate to the United States, right? If you're applying for an immigrant visa, right, or wanting to consider jumping from legal permanent residence to U.S. citizenship. If you're an American, though, right? I mean, and Jono, tell me if you can. I mean, if you see any reason to the contrary. But if you're an American, okay, you're already an American. Does the fact of the existence of American citizenship based taxation, inform your decision making in whether or not to get a second citizenship? It might inform which one you try to, but if you're generally trying to steam towards a second and third citizenship, is American CBT a decision making factor, you think?
Well, no, because it doesn't go the other way. The U.S. is the only country that does it. So if you're an American living at home in the U.S., if the home is the U.S. for you, then acquiring a second citizenship is not so much a liability. The fact that the U.S. has citizenship taxation doesn't change anything about that. So no, there's no real downsides. I mean, there are some downsides to acquiring second citizenships, depending on the country and some of the baggage it might have. But the fact that the U.S. is going to tax you wherever is irrelevant. And by the way, that's another interesting aspect of U.S. law. Is basically, as I understand it, Parviz, the U.S. does not really recognize that you are a citizen of multiple countries. In their eyes, you're always an American first and foremost, and it doesn't matter. They're basically indifferent to the fact that you might have two or three other citizenships, and so that's one of the reasons why when you enter the U.S., you have to do it on a U.S. passport. But yeah, to your question, no, it doesn't. It shouldn't influence your decision. If you're an American and you don't have any other citizenship, it should not influence your decision. The fact that the U.S. has citizenship taxation, whether you want to get another citizenship, that shouldn't affect you.
Yeah, I agree. And Journal, yeah, what you're referring to is basically called the master nationality rule. Okay, so the master nationality rule is basically the idea that if you are a multiple citizen, right, and then you're in the country of one of those citizenships, what are you treated as? Are you treated as a citizen of what country, right? U.S. follows the master nationality rule, which means basically if you're a U.S. citizen, even if you're a dual or triple citizen, when you're in the U.S., you're considered a U.S. citizen. And typically, the headline, you know, quote unquote benefit that you give up in that scenario is basically foreign consular assistance. Okay, so hypothetical, let's say you're a Canadian American citizen, you're in the US, right? You're treated only as a US citizen. It basically means that you're giving up your rights to consular assistance from your home country, from your country of Canada under the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, right? There's other effects as well too, but that's kind of like the example, the big example that's used. And yeah, the US follows that. It's not, US isn't the only country that follows the master nationality rule. A lot of other countries do. But then also, as you said, Jono, and I've tweeted a lot about this as well. I don't know if you've seen this, but U.S. under federal law requires American citizens not just to enter on a U.S. passport, but to exit bearing a U.S. passport, right? And I have beef with that. I have a problem with that. I think it's a totally unnecessary restriction on the freedom of Americans, and basically provides this big vulnerability, right? Because if you're a multiple citizen, and if by U.S. federal law you can only enter and exit on the U.S. passport, right? Well, that's a bottleneck, right? What if you don't? What if you lost the passport? What if you don't have the passport? What if you can't get the passport, right? There's a lot of other things. So that's a problem. That's something I don't like, of course, about American law with regards to how multiple citizens are treated. But of course, it is what it is. That's the case. So, Journo, you touched upon, you just in passing, you basically said, the CBT is not necessarily a big factor if you're an American in the US pursuing a second citizenship, but there could be other ones. There could be other factors, right? And I think that's super important. Super important. That's what I call the red flags of second citizenship. It's just kind of a term I coined for an article that I wrote about 3 years ago. I basically said I said there's four major red flags of second citizenship. What I define as a red flag of second citizenship is an onerous extraterritorial obligation you pick up when you become a citizen of another country. Now, let me unpack that, what that means, right? What I'm talking about is disadvantages, okay, that you pick up from becoming a citizen in a foreign country that affect you even when you're outside of that country. A disadvantage that you cannot get away from by just leaving the country. Okay. So a non-extraterritorial, disadvantage or obligation could be things like, there's high crime in the country, or it's a poor economic system, or it's a poor country, or they have, stifling social laws or stifling dress laws, or a penal code, okay, that's unfavorable. These are all issues. They matter, of course, but these are all issues that if you leave the place geographically, like literally leave the soil, they're minimized or even entirely eliminated in their effect on you. What I'm concerned about, and what I'm concerned about most for my clients, and what I think people should be the most concerned about, are extraterritorially imposed obligations. It means basically you pick up the citizenship and now you have a new obligation that is with you. It follows you wherever you go. It's something you're going to have to deal with for the rest of your life, or until the country changes that law, right? There's a lot of these types of extraterritorial obligations. I think that there's four that are kind of the most important to be aware of, right? And most important is a combination of two factors: A, the most impactful, and then B, like kind of the most common, right? First one would be citizenship-based taxation, right? Giorno already said it at the beginning, right? That's obviously something. It's an obligation you pick up, follows you everywhere, no matter if you're in that country or not. Second, mandatory military service. Third, prohibition on renunciation of the citizenship. Fourth, picking up citizenship in a broadly economically sanctioned country. Okay. So that's an issue if you pick up citizenship in a particular country and that country and its citizens are subject to international sanctions. If you become a citizen in a country, okay, whose citizens are heavily sanctioned, right? You may have just picked up a liability that's going to follow you, even if you go to the U.S. or Canada, or well, maybe not the U.S. if you're an American dual citizen, right? Because you're shielded to some extent by your U.S. citizenship. But when you go to third countries, right, you're going to carry that obligation with you. Okay. And then I have this fifth category, which I basically I titled it other country specific considerations, right? So the idea is, in some countries, you give up something by naturalizing in a third country, right? So, for example, inability to run for public office, that's a problem in some countries. It's not a problem in the United States, right? You can still run for Congress or Senate or even the presidency, being a dual citizen. But in other countries, that is a particular problem. In the US, one problem can be getting a federal security clearance, right? Federal security clearance is at the lowest level. It's not this super duper rare thing. There's a few million people that have U.S. federal security clearances. And being a dual citizen is a negative factor among a multi-factor test, okay, for basically qualification for that. So for somebody who's an American that's considering, trying to pursue a second or third citizenship, if you have a career in government or government contracting, or if you think that that's something you may realistically pursue in the future, then you might want to put the brakes on pursuing another citizenship, right? So these are what I consider the red flags, the important considerations, right? And I think a lot of people get very confused about what is the proper criteria for determining whether you pursue citizenship in another country or not. And I find that this most often comes up when somebody has eligibility for an ancestral citizenship that's from an unpopular country or a poor country or a so-called third world country, right? A lot of people say, well, why should I apply to get citizenship in that country, right? It's a poor country. It's a country I don't like. I don't know the language, all these other types of things. And my response is basically, I think you have to put the considerations into two categories: things that you just don't like that would make you maybe not want to live there or live there for a long period of time, right? And then there's the red flags, the extraterritorially imposed obligations. The latter category is what matters, okay? Because that's the real, those are the real drawbacks. The things that are in the first category, you can just, you're unaffected or minimally affected, basically, by those negative aspects when you're outside of the country. Okay. Meanwhile, you pick up the positives of having the second or third citizenship, even if it's in a poor country, a third world country. And I had a tweet just earlier today talking about how on the long timeline, even third world countries are safe havens, right? And it's the idea that to a starving man, even a hot dog from 7-Eleven is a lifesaver, right? If you're in a really bad jam, right? Today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, your child 40 years from now, okay? If you're in an absolute war zone, okay? If you're in a kill zone, okay? Anywhere is a safe haven. Anywhere that's reasonably peaceful is a safe haven for you, okay? Even if it's a country that is like the most, one of the most undesirable countries to live on, on planet Earth. And if you have the citizenship in that country, you have immediate highest right of entry and residency in that country. Okay, most of the time it doesn't have to be maintained. It's no maintenance or low maintenance, right? Meaning you don't have to file regularly or check in or anything like that. There's a few exceptions here and there to that, right? At least in the law, okay, by letter of the law. It's a long term, extremely low maintenance or no maintenance option. That's basically the way I look at it, right? And so that's why I'm a big advocate for obviously any type of dual citizenship, especially American dual citizenship, especially for people that have access to one of those ancestral citizenships in a country that's not considered that desirable.
Yeah, I agree. I was trying to write some of my notes down before you got done. But yeah, when I'm looking at as an American, when I'm looking at other citizenships possibly to acquire, the first thing I always look is whether that country allows dual citizenship. And many people may not be aware of this, but there's plenty of countries that don't allow dual citizenship. So if you wanted to become a citizen, you'd have to give up your American citizenship. And another aspect of that as well is there are countries out there that they may allow you to become a citizen, but they don't allow you to acquire an additional citizenship afterwards. So if you're considering getting more than one, or really any time in the future, you have to consider, does this country allow me to naturalize in a third country afterwards? Some of them don't. Another thing too is if I'm not mistaken, is there is an increasing tendency for banks and so on to ask you all of your nationalities. And if you have a nationality in a heavily sanctioned country or whatever, I mean, again, as you said, Parvis, maybe if you're an American, it's not such a big problem because you're kind of shielded by that U.S. Identity. But if you're, especially if you're not, you know, it would be a problem potentially if you had a citizenship in a really heavily sanctioned country. It's also, I would say, important to remember that when you're applying for residence permits and so on, a lot of countries will ask you for background checks in all of your countries of citizenship. And they might ask for paperwork from all of your countries of citizenship. In other words, there are these obligations you don't necessarily think about. Now, that doesn't mean I'm telling people not to get a second citizenship. I think overall, it's something everybody would benefit from, having another second citizenship. But there are these things to be aware of. Military service is another one. I mean, you know, if you had gotten Ukrainian citizenship a few years ago, you know, would you really feel safe in parts of Europe? Like, are they going to be looking for you, or you know, what's the deal? So there are things to be aware of in that regard. Oh, and another thing I want to say too, when you there are many countries in the world where when you acquire a second citizenship in that country, they will require you to renew your passport before it expires, or you could lose that citizenship. That's not uncommon in places in Latin America. So if you if you become a citizen in one of these countries and then you let your passport expire for 10 years, you don't return to the country, you might lose that citizenship. So just be aware that becoming naturalized in a new country does not necessarily mean you're going to stay there if you don't return. So be aware of that.
Yeah, Jonah, you bring up a lot of great points. Yeah, you're right. With regards to banking, yeah, more and more they're asking for all the citizenships, right? And that kind of touches on the point number 12 that I read at the beginning, which is having associations with two different countries, right? Now, there's some countries that obviously have letter of the law sanctions against them, either unilateral or multilateral, right? But then also, sometimes even a negative association can, not because there's necessarily a sanction against them, but some companies, some banks, some entities could basically consider it to be high risk for them to deal with somebody who's a citizen of that particular country. So that's obviously that's a factor. That has to be a factor, right? Of getting another citizenship. And then, yeah, the background checks. Yes. So we touched on this in the last mobility space. Generally, when you apply for citizenship or even residency in another country, you're asked for background checks from your countries of citizenship. So, of course, it follows that the more citizens you pick up, right, the more work you're going to have to do when you apply in the future for another citizenship, right? Because you're going to have to now pick up a background check from that citizenship. So, yeah, that does present some additional bureaucratic drag, right, on your future, your future applications, no doubt. It should be a consideration. It should be something to think about. I don't think in most cases it's necessarily a deal breaker, right? But in some cases it may matter. It may actually be material. And then, yeah, the other thing is the order. What's the order of citizenship, right? It's common to talk about, does the country allow dual citizenship or do they not allow dual citizenship? The reality is there's a lot of gray areas in between, right? You have a country like Slovakia, perfect example, I think, of what Jorna was just mentioning. You can naturalize into Slovak citizenship with as many citizenships as you want and keep them all, okay? But once you're Slovak, in order to naturalize again or naturalize in another country, okay, you have to be resident in that next country for at least 5 years in order to maintain your Slovak citizenship, right? So would you say Slovakia allows dual citizenship? Do they prohibit dual citizenship? Neither of those statements are really sufficient in describing it, right? it's a much more conditional statement. Slovakia unequivocally allows dual citizenship if you're naturalizing into Slovak citizenship, but very limitedly on a limited basis if you're naturalizing elsewhere after obtaining Slovak citizenship, right? So yeah, that's absolutely, that's an important consideration, especially, if you're really a nerd about these things, or if you're really into, picking up, if you have a long-term plan to pick up 3, 4, 5 citizenships, and you have an idea of what you want to do, you might start thinking about proper order. What's the order you go in, right? Because obviously, you might want to stack the more difficult countries, let's call them, towards the end of your processes, right? If you're going to be naturalizing.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Ideally, if you're really thinking about getting a second citizenship, well, first of all, look in your ancestry, your lineage. What do you qualify for? So I think that's something we should really talk about. And I wish Patrick was here, but a lot of Americans are eligible for citizenships abroad that they don't even know about. I would estimate probably, I don't know what it is, Parvis, 30%, 40%, something like that, because somewhere in your family you have somebody who was from Europe and they were from a country that allows, 2 or 3 generations down the line for their descendants to apply for citizenship, whether it's, Ireland, or whether it's, Italy or Slovakia. I think Slovakia is 4 generations. So if your, whatever that is, great grandfather was Slovakian, you might be eligible. And there's all these different things. So if you're thinking about second citizenship, the first thing you should look at is, what are you eligible for free? It doesn't have to require boots on the ground necessarily. Doesn't have to require a lot of money. Just what are you eligible for? And you have to look at your records and talk to someone like Parvis, who is an expert in this. And that's a great place to start. The other thing I would say, when you're looking for, if you're an American considering dual citizenship, I mean, ideally for me, it's a country that, first of all, I'm eligible for. I can, whether it's through investment, whether it's through descendants, whatever, something I can attain. Secondly, the country allows, they allow dual citizenship. They don't have really any obligations. There's not like mandatory military service. It's basically something I can get, and it's not adding too much baggage. So yeah, I just said 2 different things, but maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. And Jonah, we had, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we had an entire space on citizenship by descent for Americans. Yes, that's, if you're American, just by pure statistics, the first place you should look is by descent, right? And obviously, there's so many countries, of course, in the world, but really the countries that just by pure numbers, right? If I know nothing about you and I just know you're American, I'm going to say look to Italy, Ireland, Hungary, Croatia, Slovakia, Poland, right? Those would be the main countries. These are the countries that have the combination of having sent the most immigrants to the United States in the last 120 years and have the most liberal, shall we say, citizenship by descent policies, right? Slovakia, you're absolutely right. So if you're the child, grandchild, or great grandchild of a Czechoslovak or Slovak citizen that was born in the territory of modern day Slovakia, prima facie, okay, it looks like you probably qualify for Slovak citizenship by descent, right? Most of these citizenships by descent don't have a language requirement. Some of them do. Some have incorporated, right? So Hungary has a really, really expansive citizenship by descent law, no generational limit. All right. This is a naturalization, but you have to be able to speak Hungarian. So that's a little bit of a bottleneck. But going back to kind of where to look, right? So yeah, I mean, the first thing is, what's the number of Americans that possibly qualify for citizenship by descent? A number that gets bandied about, is 40%. That was from an article, that was in Forbes like 3 years ago. I think it's a little bit high. If I had to guess, I would say more in the 25 to 30% range. But the bottom line is it's a lot, right? So yeah, if you're American, of course, first place to look at is your family tree. Okay. And there's a lot written on this. I have a lot of articles. I have an article actually for Family Tree magazine, right? Which kind of goes over the basics of, how to think about the issue of screening yourself or getting screened for citizenship by descent. I won't go over all of them right now, but I'll just basically say 2 big things, 2 big tips. Number one, I'd say the big tip is the proper screening is huge. Okay, I would say being properly screened for eligibility is the biggest step of the whole process, even more so than actually applying. Okay, I know that sounds, maybe controversial to say, but getting a proper screening for which you need ancestral documents, and that's a whole nother thing as well. Once you've been properly screened, I'd say it's actually downhill after that, including the actual preparation submission of the application. It's not to say it's easy or everybody gets approved afterwards. It just means the bigger task is the actual proper screening. But yeah, citizenship by descent, of course, right? And then if you're in the United States and you're not looking to go traveling to be resident in another country, then of course we have citizenship by investment, and then we have residencies by investment that allow you to get on the track for naturalization eligibility with minimal physical presence in that other country, right? So those are the two ways of quote unquote paying your way into another citizenship. Now, I mean, I'm a big fan of not just putting forth marketing hype, but I try to talk about really all aspects. Try to be an advisor, right? Talk about attack vectors. And we're seeing now, right, that citizenship by investment is under attack. Okay, it's under a lot of attacks, right, from different jurisdictions, from supranational organizations, and the upshot is that citizenships by investment are kind of more fragile. They're more fragile in a couple of ways. One, in terms of being stripped, okay, being subject to involuntary revocation. Okay, we're seeing that citizenships by investment are taken back more easily and more often by countries, that perceive some sort of negative PR for having you as a citizen. And then the other way they're under attack is their individual benefits, right? Increasingly, we're starting to see little by little, there's some, countries that are trying to deny particular springboard benefits to economic citizens of a particular country, meaning that, certain countries are trying to basically say, oh, yes, we give visa-free access to this country. Anybody who's a citizen of this country has visa-free access here, except if you got your citizenship by investment, Or number two, anybody, for example, the E2 treaty visa in the United States, anybody from, Portugal, if you're a Portuguese citizen, okay, or, whatever, any country that's member to the E2 treaty, the E2 visa treaty, anybody that's a citizen is eligible for the E2 visa, except if you got your citizenship by investment. In that case, you have to be domiciled in that country for at least 3 years before you qualify. So that's an attack on the springboard benefits of the citizenship only for citizens by investment, right? Now, what does this mean? Does this mean you never get citizenship by investment, don't get it out at all? No, not at all. It's still worth it for many people. But be aware of the real, lay of the land. Be aware of really what the attack vectors are now and what is shaping up, to be real attack vectors. And that's why you don't go to salesmen, okay? You don't go to salespeople for citizens, CBI salespeople, okay? Which is rah, 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 yes, 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 let's get you into this passport. Let's get you into this citizenship. You want to go to real advisors, lawyers, consultants. How do I define? There's a couple, heuristics that I put out there for people to tell the difference between whether you're dealing with a real advisor or a salesperson that's just trying to make the commission. Okay, the first one is does that professional ever talk about drawbacks and attack vectors? Do they ever talk about drawbacks and attack vectors? Do they even mention it, or is it all just unbridled enthusiasm? Yes, yeah, man, cool. We're gonna get you into 5 passports, 3 passports. We can't get you into these passports. All this type of stuff. That's a good litmus test. Okay, if it's all enthusiasm and rah rah rah, let's get you, the citizenship and the passport. You're probably dealing with a salesperson. If you're talking to somebody who's bringing your attention to drawbacks, attack vectors, issues, okay, then you're probably dealing with a real advisor, right? The other one is, are you paying to talk to them? If you're not paying to talk to the person, you're dealing with a salesperson, okay? Real advisors, real advocates, real lawyers, real consultants, okay, that are experienced and have expertise in the field, they don't talk to you for free, okay? The time is valuable and they're giving real advice. They're not talking to you for free, knowing that they're going to gain back their money from that time, okay, through a massive commission, right, on the back end. So those are kind of the two heuristics that it's not 100%, but those are two good ways to determine whether you're actually talking to somebody who's going to really talk to you about potential issues that are on the horizon. So if you're an American, citizenship by descent, hands down, that's the first thing you try to get screened for. If you have the money and you're not trying to travel, right, then citizenship by investment. If you are an American, you don't qualify for citizenship by descent, and you are interested in traveling or spending significant time elsewhere, right? Then you get into these residencies, right? Residencies that have a path to naturalization, right? And the world is such a big place. It's impossible to really talk about all of them or say what's good for Americans or what's not. It requires obviously way more in-depth analysis. But I will say, the issue is if you pick up residency elsewhere and you spend significant time on the ground there, then you have to become aware of other obligations that trigger. Okay. First among them, of course, being potential tax residency in a foreign country, right? And it's not something I'm going to go into great detail on because that's out of my lane. That's adjacent to my lane. I'm a mobility lawyer. Those are tax issues, right? And you definitely want to go to a tax expert, tax attorney for that, right? So but at least you got to be aware of this. I make my clients aware of this if they're going to pick up a residency in another country. But yeah, so then there's that, and then of course there's other more unusual ways of getting citizenship in another country. Citizenship by exception, right? People who are exceptional can sometimes apply for and get citizenship in another country, right? So kind of the big example is Olympic athletes, right? Countries want gold medals, okay? And so sometimes they're willing to bend the rules, not really bending the rules actually, because it is lawful most of the time in those countries, but they're willing to waive requirements for naturalization in order to naturalize somebody who's going to compete basically and wave their flag at the Olympics and possibly win a gold or silver medal or a bronze medal, right? So that's kind of the big example, but it's not just athletes, great artists, great entrepreneurs, great public figures, sometimes they can qualify for citizenship by exception in other countries, and even investors can as well too, right? You have citizenship by marriage, right? Which is, again, not that common, right? People conflate residency by marriage with citizenship by marriage. They are two different things. Many countries, dare I say most countries, have residency by marriage, meaning you can be eligible for residency in the country by being married to a citizen. Sometimes oftentimes that residency leads to naturalization in that country after a period of residency. That's not citizenship by marriage. That's residency by marriage. When I say citizenship by marriage, I mean you get married, okay, and the next application is a citizenship application, not a residency application, right? That's much more rare, okay, but some countries have it, right? Patients might know about one country that has that, right? Hint, hint, if you want to chime in there, patients. So some countries allow a person to naturalize by marriage, and interestingly, some countries actually have basically automatic conferral of citizenship by operation of law if you marry one of their citizens, right? In which case you still have to send an application, but you're sending an application to be recognized as a citizen, not to become a citizen. And that's kind of a whole nother topic, right? But yeah, that's the order that I think about, not for everybody, but that's my default ordering for screening somebody that's an American that's looking for citizenship elsewhere, right? I start with that, and then if they based off of their their profile, then yeah, sometimes we'll switch things around in how we order, looking at second citizenships, based off of what factors they have going for them.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. There are so many. I mean, you've refreshed my memory by marriage, and there's all these different things you can do. Also, too, if you happen to have a child with a citizen of another country, in some cases, that can also get you citizenship much quicker. So that's another thing. And I will also say, if you're considering citizenship through residency, be very careful before you dive into a country, because oftentimes, at least in Latin America especially, but other places as well, what the law says and what actually happens are two different things. So if you're an American and you're thinking about, oh, I just go live in that country, look, after 2 years I can become a citizen. It's not always that easy. A lot of times it's up to their discretion. A lot of times, like we saw in Panama, the former president was not signing any of the citizenship decrees, so nobody was getting citizenship, even though they had met the residency requirements. New presidents come in, he's starting to sign them. I mean, there's all these little things. So before you dive into a country, make sure that you look at, okay, here's what the law says, boots on the ground, here's how much my residency I need. And here's what actually has been people's experience. And then there's a difference too. Once you apply, there's lengthy amounts of time that can before you get your application, through the bureaucracy and through the system. So there's a lot of things to consider, and also want to say too about residency. And by the way, residency is kind of a loaded term because you can have residency in a country without necessarily needing to spend any time there. Every country is different, but some countries you can have a residency permit and you only need to stay there like 1 day a year. Okay, I think Paraguay is like that, but there's other countries as well. Other countries, if you have a residency permit, as soon as you're out of the country more than 6 months in a year, you lose it. And if you're in a country more than 6 months a year, most countries that means you're a tax resident. That means your income is going to be taxed by that country. And if you're an American, that means you're a dual tax resident of two countries. So I don't want to make this all about taxes, but the point is, if you're an American considering dual citizenship and you want to acquire it through residency, there's a lot of variables that you need to consider.
Excellent point. Yeah, and I want to touch on this issue that you brought up, which is letter of the law and practice of the law. Huge, huge issue, and this is where really a lot of, I don't mean to be too toxic here, but I'll be a little toxic. This is where fake mobility influencers really reveal themselves, right? Go on, not even primary source legal materials. Go on Wikipedia, pull up an article, say, "Oh, I can get citizenship after 2 years," right? In Dominican Republic or wherever it is, right? No concept of actually the idea that what happens on the ground can be, in some cases, actually, in most cases, there's some delta between what the law says and what happens on the ground. In some cases, it's totally different, actually, right? And then there's the other issue, which is that they're not even reading from primary source legal materials. They're reading basically an interpretation, right? It's like a supercharged game of whisper. They're reading one interpretation of another interpretation of the primary source material, and then by the time they're consuming it and regurgitating it to their followers, the actual meaning is totally distorted, right? Or entirely, or sometimes even dead wrong, right? So what happens on the ground is so important. It's so critical, right? You got to know, okay, what does the letter of the law say, okay, that you're entitled to, and then what happens actually on the ground, right? And I had Giorno, I had a mobility meme from 2.5 years ago. It was the soup Nazi from Seinfeld, and I basically put the word Panama over his head, and then I had him underneath saying "No citizenship for you," right? And that's exactly talking about what you just mentioned, right? Which is the law said you can qualify for citizenship after a period of residency. I think it was only 5 years, but in practice, I posted there. I was totally open about it. I have not. I wrote 2.5 years ago. I've not come across a person who's naturalized. I've tried. I've looked far and wide. If you've ever naturalized, or if you know somebody personally who's naturalized, please let me know. I just like to just meet
Well,
you and see if you're real.
I have not. This is secondhand, but there was an influencer. I won't mention the name, but they're pretty well known. And they say that with the new president, they have absolutely confirmed people are getting citizenships because the new president is signing the citizenship document. So that might be a little update to pay attention to. And
Yeah.
I also want to say too, just because you've met the residency requirements and all the other stuff, don't forget there's also oftentimes language requirements, and you have to take a history test sometimes, and so on. So there are other things as well to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and great clarification. So my post and my meme was from 2.5 years ago. Yes, maybe that's an update. I don't know. I don't have personal knowledge on that, but that's possibly, of course, that's certainly possible, right? Things change, and that'd be great if that's the case. I hope that's the case, right? But yeah, the bottom line is you got to be really discerning about your source of information, right? Anybody can say and write anything on social media, and they do, and in this realm, in citizenship and residency, I'm just gonna say the majority of it is wrong. Okay, the majority of the info that's put out there is wrong. I mean that literally over 50%. Okay, I feel that's a very conservative estimate. Really, I feel it's much higher than that. Right, so you got to be really, really careful. Okay, all it takes is one influencer to make a statement, and then it gets repeated by, it's an echo chamber. It gets repeated by another influencer, and then it gets repeated by another influencer, and then before you know it, it's considered like common knowledge. Okay, and they can be dead wrong. Okay, and they are. There's many of these types of things floating around like that. You know, when you talk about passports and citizenship, self-sovereignty, sovereign individual theory, you're talking about law. Okay, let's not get it twisted. This is law. Okay, it's not lifestyle design. Lifestyle design is an ancillary kind of, secondary thing related to it. You're talking about the law. Okay, so if you're talking about the law, okay, you got to read the law. Okay, that's really the bottom line. I know it's not fun or sexy to talk about. It's much more sexy to just say, 5 passports, 4 passports, whatever, and all these fantastical plans that are not more than reality. But if you're looking for actionable information, you got to be careful. Now, I've kind of come to the realization over the last year or two that everybody might not be looking for actionable information. Some people might just like the entertainment value of it, the aspect, just to kind of daydream about these crazy plans, that are not realistic, and that's fine. Of course, people get entertainment in different types of ways. But if you're looking for real info, be careful. Okay, and what I say is follow practitioners. Follow practitioners. That's how you get to the bottom of things, not people. If you can follow lifestyle bloggers and that type of thing, right? They might have great recommendations on, I don't know, it's like the best bars and clubs and kind of what the vibe is on the ground and stuff like that. But when you're talking about getting the actual mobility benefits, it's practitioners. That's where the info's at. But anyway, let's get off of that topic. So yeah, so for American dual citizenship, right? The big thing that I think people talk about and know about is passports, right? And right of visa-free access. Okay, I'm a broken record about the fact that a passport is not a citizenship. These are two separate things, two separate concepts. They're related. The way everything is related, okay, but they're separate. They have to be treated separately. But there's other more kind of subsurface benefits, okay, that I think don't really get that much attention, that are really, really interesting, right? 2 sets of domestic legal ID, okay. The fact of the higher level of protection from non-U.S. defamation lawsuits, nationality toggling in cyberspace. Okay, these are benefits that there's some people out there that are living the multiple citizenship lifestyle, and they kind of have figured this out, and it's great. I love to hear from them, and I also learn from other people actually like them, but they don't really get that much attention. Okay, and I think they really are going to get a lot more attention in the coming years as people really explore the limits of the benefits of being a multiple citizen, right? As well as, look, both ways, as well as, the full pain, okay, of the drawbacks of being a multiple citizen. But are there is there anybody in the discussion that's got any observations, either personal or otherwise, doesn't have to be personal, about some of the let's call them the lesser known benefits and issues of being an American dual citizen?
Well, of course, the mic's open to everybody, but I will say that, yes, I think what you said is so critical. People think of passports. First of all, they equate it to citizenship, which is a misnomer. But when you look at the visa-free access to 152 countries, visa-free or visa on arrival access, that's only telling you like how long you can stay as a tourist, generally speaking, which is could be a couple weeks, could be a couple months. But like, for example, if you do citizenship by investment in, let's say, Antigua and Barbuda in the Caribbean, you have a right to live, work, and drive a car with one driver's license in 7 different countries in the Caribbean. And you're also a member of CARICOM, which means you can go to basically anywhere in the Caribbean for about 6 months a year. If you get a passport, I'm making the mistake. If you get a citizenship in the EU, you have, and also a residence permit in the European Union, you have a right to live in basically anywhere else in the EU. So it's kind of your ticket into that area. If you get a citizenship in, let's say, Colombia, you have a right to live in any of the Mercosur countries, which is like 7 different countries in Latin America. You can live there, work there, drive there. So there's all of these benefits. There's also the APEC business card. So if you're a member of, I think there's like Chile and there's a couple other countries in Latin America. You can go if as long as you have a business and you qualify for the card, you can go all over the world for long periods of stay, and that's independent of your passport. So there's a lot of these other benefits that you as an American might not realize if you're just looking at the tourist visa-free access of the second passport.
Yeah, exactly, Journal. I talk a lot about how I mean, passport strength indices are mostly bullshit, complete bullshit. It's an exercise in measuring, it's an exercise in stating what's easy to measure, not what matters, right? Because it's very easy to just count up the number of countries that one country's citizens have visa-free access to. That doesn't take any type of expertise, right? And it totally sails past the threshold issue, which is what actually matters. What are the most important things to actually consider in terms of the benefits of a citizenship? So we're going to do a mobility space that's entirely dedicated to that open discussion of how to really measure the benefit of a citizenship. And the other reason I don't like the term passport strength indices is because it's a total misnomer. Okay, it heavily implies, if not states, that the benefits of the citizenship derive from the passport. That's not the case. Okay, and it's not just semantics. Okay, because we'll see, and I'm going to talk about. I don't want to hijack this spaces to talk about this, but I'll explain in the other spaces how there are instances, lots of instances, in which passport and citizenship are different. They're treated differently, and you have to actually distinguish whether you're talking about a person's citizenship or a person's passport, right? So yeah, 100% I agree with you, Giorno, right? You're talking about springboard residency benefits. Okay, so basically, why do I call it a springboard, right? Springboard is basically you're in location A, okay, you jump to location B, which is the springboard, okay, that's the citizenship in country B, and then you spring onto the landing pad, okay, which is residency access in country C. EU is a perfect example, right? That's a huge, huge benefit. In my experience, people are becoming hip to that. Okay, way more of my consuls, people who book consuls with me, start the conversation making reference to getting citizenship in EU countries so that they can, have access to live in the entire EU. 4 years ago, just 4 years ago, the majority of my consults, I believe, I haven't exactly counted it up, were not really aware of that. Either it was very fuzzy for them or they didn't understand at all the idea of basically right of residency in the EU, okay, afforded by European Union citizenship. That's a huge thing, okay? Now, I want to go even a step further. I want to double click and look at that right in high definition, okay? The right of residency in a third country, okay? I call that a satellite residency right, okay? Satellite residency right, okay? Versus a core residency right. Let me explain what I mean here, okay? You get citizenship in an EU country, okay? You have the right of residency in that EU country, okay, as well as in the other EU countries, not all, but most of the other EU countries, okay? The country that you have citizenship in gives you a core residency right. The other countries you have a satellite residency right in. Okay, why do I distinguish between the two? Why should you distinguish between the two? What does it matter? Right of residency is right of residency. It's not. Okay, they're not equal in robustness. Okay, and I unpacked this in an article that I wrote about 2 years ago. If anybody wants to look it up, it's called Core versus Satellite Residency Rights. But the upshot is, okay, your satellite residency right, okay, is subject to way more degradation, possible degradation in the future than your core residency right. Okay. And I have an example. Okay. Perfect example. Okay. Let's say I'll just read from this section of the article. It's a short excerpt. Okay. Both core and satellite residency rights are vulnerable to dissolution or division of the core country of citizenship, such as happened in Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Sudan, Austro-Hungary, and countless other countries over the last century. However, the satellite residency is vulnerable to at least 4 more potential changes over time than the core residency right. In our example above, the satellite residency right could be diminished or even eviscerated by any one of these 4 examples. One country's exit from the European Union, the other country's exit from the European Union, a material change to Article 21 of the TEFU. Okay, that's basically that's the treaty that gives residency rights to EU citizens. One country's potential unlawful restriction or prohibition of the other country's right of residency in the former country. Okay, so these are all attack vectors that exist for the satellite residency that don't exist for the core residency. Okay, now does that mean the residency doesn't exist? It doesn't matter. We shouldn't give credit to it. No, it absolutely matters. It's there, but it has to be the strength of that residency, that satellite residency has to be properly discounted. Okay, if you're really looking at this properly, right? Perfect example is UK. If you got British citizenship, okay, in large part relying on the fact, okay, that you have access. So let's say you get British citizenship in 2017, relying on the fact that you're going to have right of residency in the entire EU. Well, unfortunately, by just a few short years later, okay, you no longer had right of residency through your British citizenship, in the majority of Europe, okay, because the UK left the European Union, right? So that's a perfect example. So it's really important to look at these things, okay, these rights, okay, properly, okay. They're not monolithic, they're not equal in strength, they're not equal in nature, okay. You have to actually dig deeper to find out what is the source of that right, okay, and then what are the attack vectors and vulnerabilities of the source of that right.
Yeah, definitely. I also wanted to say, if you're an American, you never had a you never had a second citizenship. There is something really liberating and great feeling when you get that second citizenship, and you especially, I will say, it's not just getting the passport and realizing that you're a citizen, but it's being able to travel on that second travel document, and that other country lets you in, and they stamp you on that passport. There is something. It feels like shackles and chains being lifted off, because I'm not beholden to one country anymore. I have this other option. And my increasing belief with the world is that in a world where everything is connected digitally and everybody can travel everywhere and so on, the only freedom you really have, because as we're seeing in the West, okay, these supposed bastions of free speech and all that stuff is at a moment's notice taken away. And the real freedom in the 21st century, to me, it seems, is the freedom of mobility. And if you have a couple different citizenships and you have the ability to travel, then you are far more able to be a free person in the world than if you're beholden only to one citizenship, and especially the U.S. citizenship, which, it's a pretty good consular network. It's a pretty good travel document, the passport and so on. But there's a lot of baggage. The U.S. has been at war with a lot of countries. It has citizenship taxation. No other country does that. And so if you're an American considering it, it's absolutely worth considering, if it's not a huge hindrance to your life. The last thing I wanted to say as well is, even though the visa-free travel, I agree with you, Parvis, is kind of a silly metric that influencers use and stuff. It's not a meaningless metric, and I think that should be stated as well. If, for example, if you have a Vanuatu passport and you want to travel to the Caribbean, you're going to have to go through, probably from Vanuatu, you're probably going to have to fly through Europe or through the United States. Now, the United States is a sterile transit country, meaning if your country doesn't have visa-free access to the U.S., you can't fly through the U.S. unless you get a visa. And Europe doesn't have visa-free access for Vanuatu citizens. So it's like, and I don't know all the transit rules for every country in the EU, but I'm just saying, I agree that the visa-free travel thing is a little bit of a marketing thing, but it's not meaningless. If you can get a citizenship with a lot of visa-free access, it's certainly helpful when traveling through a lot of airports, if nothing else.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I hope I didn't give the impression that I think it's meaningless. No, it's not
No, you
meaningless.
didn't. You
It's
didn't.
okay, perfect. Yeah, it is a meaningful springboard benefit. It just ain't the most important benefit of a second citizenship. And that's kind of what my big objection is to it, as well as the fact that, like I said, there's this, calling a citizenship a passport has a lot of really negative effects on people's mental model of things. But I think probably the most insidious one is that it gives the impression that something that is extremely complex, citizenship, is much more simple than it is. Okay, that it's like it's a passport. All right. But yeah, there's you brought up great points, Journo. Traveling on another document, right? It gives, of course, a person a feeling of freedom, right? And a lot of people have written about that, have spoken about that, who are multiple citizens. Then there's another thing that I want to talk about here, right? So Trump just announced another visa ban yesterday, right? It's a souped up version of his quote unquote Muslim ban 1.0 from his first term, right? And it restricts access to the United States of nationals of certain countries, right? Iran, Venezuela, I think it's about 11 other countries. But guess who's exempted from it? Okay, so well, first of all, people who are American citizens obviously are exempted from it. Okay, so if you're a citizen of Iran, for example, but you're also a U.S. citizen, you're still coming into the U.S. all the same. But also people who are citizens of the targeted countries and dual citizen with a non-targeted country, if the person travels on the passport of the non-targeted country. This is a perfect example of nationality toggling. Okay, so let's say you're an Iranian French citizen, for example, right? You're not subject to I mean, now you might have other problems, right? In terms of, difficulties in terms of getting a visa, right? If you're an Iranian citizen, but you're not subject to this travel ban, okay? If you are trying to access the United States as a French citizen on the French passport, even if you also hold Iranian nationality, okay? So that's a perfect example of nationality toggling, okay? Now, Journo, one thing that you were talking about, this idea of basically option of freedom, right? This is something I think a lot about, I read a lot about, I research a lot about, and the way I've distilled this concept down, at least for me, and the way I explain it, okay, is that when you go from one citizenship to two citizenships, you increase your freedom, of course. When you go from two to three, you increase your freedom for, even more so. When you go from three to four, you increase it more so. But there's diminishing returns, okay, on how much additional, freedom you enjoy by adding additional citizenships. The important jump, the most important jump, the key jump, in my opinion, is from one to two, one citizenship to two. And the reason is I call it the genesis of choice. Okay, that is the genesis of option. Okay, the word option, okay, both in the definition, it implies the ability to choose. Okay, choice means there has to be an existence of more than one. Okay, otherwise there's no choice. Okay, citizenship, going from one citizenship to two citizenships, is the genesis of choice among nation states. Okay, robust choice. Yes, you can be a citizen with a residency in another country, but I don't consider that to be the most robust choice because residency permits have expiration dates. Okay, they're more easily rescindable. They typically don't offer, the right to apply for a passport. Okay, citizenship, a second citizenship in another country, offers highest immediate right of entry and residency in that country, and typically access to a passport to travel on. That's the genesis of a person's choice. Okay, they can add additional, citizenships for more freedom after that, but the big jump, okay, is, again, sounding like a broken record here, going from one citizenship to two. Okay, this is what I call Peter Thiel's 0 to 1. Okay, this is the leap. This is the leap where something is created out of nothing. Okay, that's option. Okay, that option does not exist with one citizenship. It starts to exist when you have two citizenships, robust option, basically, and mobility.
Yes, I think that's so well said, Parvis. And America is such a nationalistic country. And increasingly, I think a lot of Americans are starting to question, is America the greatest thing in the world since sliced bread? Or maybe there's more to the world than just the United States. And America's a great country. It's got a lot of benefits and virtues and wonderful things. But it's not the whole world. And I think a lot of Americans are starting to feel that way. And I can tell you, if you're listening to this podcast, that when you become a dual citizen, the first time you go through an airport and they stamp you in on that second citizenship, it is quite a remarkable feeling, just like Parvis is talking about. It's like going from 0 to 1. And you realize, you know what? My life isn't over. Like I'm able to have this second, like my life is able to continue going on even without my U.S. citizenship and that American flag. Things still keep going. And I think, like you say, Parvis, the most important, if you can, don't put your whole life on hold and stop everything for it. But if you can, and if you're interested, and if you're able to, within reason, it is worth pursuing.
Absolutely. Well said. Okay, so we're at 12:12. We've been going for an hour and 12 minutes now. We typically get, I can tell from the numbers, we do get a significant number of anonymous listeners. So I'm assuming there's probably other people out there that are not here. But I think now might be a good time to wrap this up, unless there's anything else you want to talk about or say. And we have so much more to unpack, right? I just want to keep these discussions, palatable size wise, right? But we have a lot more mobility spaces coming up. We're going to talk about. I'm going to have, we're going to have a session entirely dedicated to the concept of springboard benefits. What's a springboard benefit? We're going to have a space entirely dedicated to what actually matters in a citizenship. How should you rate a citizenship? If it's not, I said here, it ain't visa-free access. That's not the most important one. So what is it? Obviously, right? Somebody should challenge me and say, okay, well, tell us what it is then. Oh, I will. Okay, we're going to unpack that. And again, just to reiterate, visa-free access still matters. My belief is it's not the most important. We're going to talk about Elon Musk's citizenships. He's a great case study because he's got a lot of citizenships. He's got at least 3, one of which is American, and he's got over 10 kids. So that just is a treasure trove of interesting topics for us to talk about. We're going to talk about a lot of different things. We're going to have a lot of spaces moving forward. So um, if anybody's interested in listening to these or participating in the future, you're welcome. Anybody can come up to speak at any time. This is totally open. Just send me a request and I'll grant it. And if anybody has likes any of the topics that I listed in my tweet, you can quote unquote vote for them by just liking the topic that you see or making a comment. And if there's a topic related to freedom of movement, sovereignty, multiple citizenship that I did not mention that you think is interesting, DM me or post it up there. And if it's something that I think is that I can speak to competently and is of interest, we'll make it a topic of discussion for one of the spaces.
I think this has been a great discussion. The only thing I want to add is I hope you get these uploaded to like all the podcast platforms, Parvi, so people can listen to these months or years from now. So Spotify, Apple Podcasts. I don't know how John does it, but like within a few hours, he's got them all uploaded. He must have some app or something that just converts the MP3 and uploads them. I don't know how he does it, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the reminder again. Yeah, John DM me to tell me the same. Make sure I download these. Yeah, I'm downloading them, and he uses an app. I forget the name of it, but he sent it to me. I'm gonna do the same. So we're gonna upload these to all major platforms, Spotify and a few others. I'm also gonna. I don't want to overwhelm people with all this content, but I'm also going to start a separate podcast as well, one-on-one discussions with other mobility practitioners that are going to get a little bit more into the weeds of things. So yeah, we're definitely going to do it. Giorno, I appreciate your contribution. You had a lot of great insights here as always, and thank you to everybody who joined. We're doing these Mondays and Thursdays. That's the schedule. So stay tuned. We'll have more. Thanks, everybody.